Welcome back to Church of the Rock's Expedited Audio Training. You know, in session 4, we learned about Yamaha digital mixing boards, and I really hope you enjoyed the hands-on training session where you got to use a board to do a sound check. And now we're going to learn in session 5 about preparing how to mix. And I really feel like any person in any kind of mixing environment, which could be in a studio or live, you really will benefit from being prepared. It's really one of the habits that separates out, a halfway decent sound tech to a really good one. And what can happen to some people too, after they've done sound for a while, they can start taking some of this for granted and not preparing as well. And that will inevitably lead to mistakes, miscues, delayed sound checks, or even like delayed rehearsals. And there's even more that you can do to prepare than we cover in this session. There's things like doing a stage plot or an input list if you have a really complex setup. So always be in mind how you could do to prepare well. I think it's going to make you really stand out above the rest. So enjoy this video and please complete all the questions after watching it, and let's get into it. Today we are talking about preparing to mix. So with all the other background information we've got so far, we now want to start putting it together, and we now want to start thinking through what we need to do before we actually get to a mixing session so that we can have the best session possible. By sometimes making a few small changes and organizing yourself in a few small ways, you can help yourself to, first of all, get better mixes and feel more prepared. You give a better impression of yourself to the worship team and pastors so that they have a greater sense of your professionalism, and it'll help you just to do a better job overall. So we're going to cover some of those main topics, main themes that will help you do that. The first one is mixing style. So before you ever even move a fader, you want to know what is your intent. What would be a good mix in the room you're in and in the situation you're in. So at Church of the Rock, we have a particular mixing style we like that includes usually a larger number of instruments, a larger number of vocals, and the overall sense is that it has a bigness to it, a fullness to it. And our vocals will only be slightly above the instruments, with background vocals around the same level of the instruments. In contrast, there's many other mixing styles. That's just one, and that's the one we go for at Church of the Rock. But if you listen to pop music, even let's say someone, for example, like Adele, her vocals will always be fairly significantly high over the instruments because her voice is the most prominent thing, and so that mixing style is definitely done a little differently. Electronic music, of course, will have a different mixing style. Most genres will have their own particular mixing styles, with certain instruments louder and certain ones quieter. So whenever you want to mix, you want to think about your particular situation, your particular band, what style you're going into it, and what would be a good mix in your situation. You always want to have a goal to shoot for, not just sort of hope randomly you'll stumble across a good mix. Another small thing that's going to help you with mixing well and mixing effectively. And it seems like might seem like a small thing, but sometimes you accumulate a lot of small improvements, you'll have larger improvements. And one of them is simply how you lay out your soundboard. So for the most part, there's a fairly standard way, if you have a regular kind of modern contemporary band, that you would lay out a soundboard. And so for example, on our mixing board, the first channel is always going to be kick. And so almost any live sound situations for almost any kind of band that has drums, bass, guitars, pianos, etc., 90% of the time, channel number 1 is going to be kick. So usually it's going to be laid out something to the effect of kick, snare, hi-hat ride, toms, overhead, so for all your drum channels, left to right. Usually the next thing beside that is bass, and then from there's going to be your pianos, and if you have any other kind of instruments, your guitars, your synthesizers, that kind of thing. And then you usually, if there's a board that has a split like ours, quite often the other side of the split is going to be your vocals. And that's going to be things like, lead vocal is almost always number 1. Even if they're not visually to the left, they're number 1, so the easiest to find for the most part. And then you have 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. In some situations, it literally is whichever vocal is on the left on the stage will be on the left on your mixing board. So that one might differ a little bit depending on your situation. So as long as you're aware of which vocal lines up with which microphone, that's the important part. And then usually things like computers, pastors' mics, other inputs are usually to the right of that, or in our case, above that over here. So the idea of getting a good layout is, first of all, that you always kind of know what you're looking for, where it is. Even if you go onto a different mixing board, into a different situation, especially at a Church of the Rock campus, for the most part, if you go far left, that's going to be kick. You go more towards the right, that's going to be your vocals, and the very far right or up top is going to be your pastors and computers. So that's going to be a pretty consistent layout on most mixing boards, and that'll help you just to make quick decisions and quick changes without getting lost. And if there is another little thing about that is for your vocalists, sometimes it's really good to put a piece of tape down, or if you can change the names on the screens, to actually put down the name of your vocalist. That way it'll help you make a more quicker association about that microphone. So if you remember the person's name but don't remember what color microphone they have, you can quickly go, oh, that's right, that's this person's mic. And you can quickly make that change. Basically what you want to do whenever you're mixing is make it as simple for yourself as possible. I like to say that you want to make it like mixing for dummies and you're the dummy. So that's always a good way to think. That way you can always make it as easy as possible. Even if you've done mixing for a while, don't start getting overconfident. I still to this day put a piece of tape down, I make lots of notes, and I do a lot of things to make it easier for myself. And that'll just help you make more consistent mixes and better mixes. So another major thing that's going to help you to get a good mix consistently every time is to rehearse and take notes. I think this is going to be a standard part of being an audio tech at Church of the Rock, is that you're going to be present for rehearsals, but don't forget that it's not just the band rehearsing, that you're rehearsing as well. So when the band is rehearsing their songs, it's a really good chance for you to really dial in your EQs, dial in your compressions, double check to make sure your gains are right. It's a good chance to try out different reverbs, different levels. If you ever wanted to try different mixing or seeing how different things sound, the rehearsal is a chance you have to do that, because during a service you don't want to experiment, because you might do something terrible and everyone will hear that. So you want to have any of that experimenting or learning done well in advance of the service, and your rehearsal is a prime time for that. So just you can practice your fader moves, so how songs change from a verse to a chorus, how they go into the bridge. And even though you don't have to memorize the exact number of bars and everything the way the musicians do, you should be able to recognize eventually that this is the verse, this is the chorus, this is the bridge, and how you might want to mix differently for those different parts. So that's a really effective thing to do. It's really helpful. And in order to remember that, because you know you're going to have quite often over 5 songs in your service, you need to make yourself notes. Otherwise you likely would forget. Especially what you want to note is what starts each song, because quite often if the mix isn't set right, a song will start and the mix will be incorrect. So there'll be some instrument that's too loud or too quiet. The mix will start badly and you'll have to quickly change it all, and everybody will hear you making those changes to the mix. What's much more preferable is that as soon as the song starts, everything is where it should be, so that it comes out sounding great. Everybody can get into the mix and you can adjust as you go. So in order to do that, you have to make yourself good notes, especially what instruments or vocals start each song. And then especially at a campus like our South Campus, where there is cameras, this will also help the camera crew know which instruments they should be on when the song starts as well. Other things you might want to note when you're making notes about services, and you can make these notes on Planning Center online if you have access to a computer or your app, or just write them down on the sheet of paper you have in front of you of your order of service. But you want to note things like who is leading each song, which instruments start each song, if there's any kind of solos or special parts from certain instruments in the songs, and if there's, let's say, different person singing different verses in the song. Things like that. You might also want to just make yourself notes about how it goes from one song to the other. Do they keep going through the song? Do they stop dead? Those kinds of things. So the best you can do to prepare yourself and make notes, the better your mixes will be. And so another really kind of critically important thing to get your mixes right, and this is again preparing to actually get mixing, is to know what an instrument's sound is like and what its purpose is in the mix. It might not be as obvious as you think, but each instrument has particular parts to its sound that you can either enhance or take away from, and each instrument is playing a certain role in the mix. It might not only just be there to sound good, it might also serve other purposes like keeping rhythm and helping the vocalist. We're going to go over each individual instrument individually, and we're going to talk through why they're important and what you're listening for. We're not going to talk specifically about how to EQ each one exactly, but more so what each one sounds like, what kind of things are present in the sound. And that way you can kind of know what a good sound is. People say they love good sound, but sometimes they wouldn't be able to tell you what they mean by that. So the more you can know what each instrument should sound like or could sound like, there's usually different potentials for that, the more you will be able to achieve that good mix. So one thing you need to know before you even get into individual instruments, what their purposes are, is what range those instruments even produce. So each instrument, each thing that creates a sound, usually produces a certain range of frequencies. It'll produce certain frequencies more than others, and it won't even produce certain frequencies at all. So for example, a kick drum will produce very low frequencies, much more so than, for example, like a violin. And so knowing that each instrument has a certain range will help you know that what it's going to sound like as a whole. One of the instruments that has probably the largest range would be something like a piano or an organ, as they usually have a fairly large octave range. And one of the least might be an electric guitar. It depends on which types. Anyhow, it's good to know that certain things have certain frequencies. And it's also good that there's certain words people will try to use to try to express how something sounds, because they're just trying to visualize a sound. So if you hear me using these words, hopefully they make sense to you, but there'll also be a graphic that'll help you with that as well. So let's go through that. So we're going to start off going along with our soundboard layout I mentioned earlier. We're going to start off with the kick. So I have a virtual sound check recording over one of our services. So we have all of our audio from a service that we can play back through our mixing board. And I'm going to go through individual instruments, let us listen to them, and then talk about what's important about them. So we're going to start off with a kick drum. So this is a faster song. Obviously the kick drum's going fairly often. There's two main parts to a kick drum sound. There's the thump and the beater. And so the thump is the very low end, just kind of where it doesn't really sound very distinct, but it has a lot of energy to it. It's what will push your subs, which usually is, if you have like, ever feel bass in a big concert, that's what you're gonna feel quite often is that kick, that part of the kick. And so that produces like the main larger body of that kick. And then the beater is the distinct, where you hear more clarity in the kick. What it comes from is most kick drums actually have a foot pedal, and the beater is actually what actually strikes the skin. So that's the kind of the sound of the beater striking the skin. It's got much more attack to it. It's got it's more in the higher, it's in the high mid range, and therefore it's much more tick, tick, tick. So when you put those two together, you get a sound that is both full and potentially clear. And what a kick will do, it'll add body to your mix, and it's also the main instrument that's going to add a tempo to a mix. So let's listen to it again and listen for those two specific parts, the thump and the beater. So hopefully you can hear that there's both of those elements in it, and that both of those things are going to be helpful in your mix. One thing to note also, that kick quite often can have a sound that sounds sort of boxy or mid-rangey, and sometimes by pulling out a little bit of EQ, you can add to the tightness and the clarity of your kick. From there, we'll move on to the snare. So snare drum is similar to a kick in some ways, where it has, again, somewhat basically two main parts to its sound. It's got a body and kind of a crack or a snap. And again, a snare drum would actually, a real snare drum would actually have snares on the bottom. They're metal coils that actually literally do snap back onto the drum head. And that's the more really distinct crack or snap sound that you get on a snare. And there's also usually a drum head that has the body to it. So both of these are going to be in a higher frequency range than the kick, but both are present. So let's listen to that. So you should have been able to hear that there was both body and a crack. The snare once again adds rhythm. Basically on any kind of drum kit, if you have a kick, snare, and hi-hat, that's where they're going to get the vast majority of their beat from. When drummers produce a drum beat, those three elements are going to be the main three things. And between those three, that's where you're going to get the vast majority of your beats. And another interesting thing is that the way drums typically go is that's also what people will clap with. So it's usually kick, snare, and everybody claps along with the snare. In our church, kind of fairly poorly, but in many other churches too, there's the idea that if you need to help someone with when they should clap, you usually just look at the person hitting the snare, and that's when you clap. So as an audio engineer, one thing you might find a bit interesting is if people are clapping really loudly, you actually will find yourself having a harder time hearing the snare because they're hitting it at the exact same time. So sometimes you might need to push your snare a bit in that room so everybody can hear the snare over the clapping or complementing with it. So good to keep that in mind. And yeah, so that's what a snare does for the most part. Again, next thing on our mixing board is our hi-hat cymbal. The hi-hat cymbal, if you're already aware what it is that it's usually two cymbals that clap up and down on each other. And there's usually a foot pedal that goes along with that. and the drummers will still hit that with their sticks, but they'll add to it using the clapping motion to change how it sounds. The hi-hat, quite often, one of the main purposes, it actually keeps the most regular beat for the most part. It's almost most similar to what a metronome might do. Quite often it might be doing 16th notes, which is more quicker, and so again, with the kick and the snare, that'll provide most of your rhythm. But the hi-hat will quite often just keep time. So let's listen to the hi-hat. It's actually not playing right now, so let me find a spot where it is playing. So that's actually good examples of both the open sound and the closed sound, and you see how they were more often than some of the other beats. So that was a good example of a hi-hat sound. There's almost no low end in a hi-hat except when they clap and open up together. Sometimes you get a little bit of a lower end sound, but for the most part it's just higher frequencies. And it's often used for people, if they're listening to try to keep themselves on time, they'll be listening to the hi-hat. So let's just quickly listen to those three elements together, like I mentioned, that make up the main part of the beat: the kick, the snare, and the hi-hat. So that's a bit of an interesting beat, but those three main parts are what make up the main rhythm for the song. The next thing is the ride cymbal. So quite often a ride has a very distinct kind of ting sound to it. It is a cymbal, but it doesn't have a big wash to it like the way a crash might. And quite often it's used instead of a hi-hat. So you'll have either the hi-hat sound or the ride cymbal. Rarely, sometimes you'll have both together at the same time, but quite often they do one or the other. And it uses a very similar purpose. It usually is more often to keep the overall time. And it'll just be a slightly different way for them to do that, slightly different sound for that. And let me just find a section so you can hear that as well. All right, so let's listen to how that ride sounds. So in this case, he's not doing it overly frequently, but you can hear that there's kind of a ting sound, and there's not a really big wash sound to it. And so that's really what a ride sound should sound like. The next one are the toms. Now, different drum kits have a different number of toms. There's usually at least one rack tom, it's called, that's in front of them on a rack. And there's usually a floor tom, which stands by itself on the floor. Electronic drum kits, quite often you're simulating these real instruments, but there should still in some way be some form of tom in front of the drummer and some more to the side. And they'll be pitched. So toms will go from a higher pitch to a lower pitch as they get larger in size. So the floor tom would always have quite a bit of low end in it, and a small rack tom might be fairly high pitched. So that way they can kind of almost, in a sense, play notes, not quite, but the idea is that they can have those three different things. So there you can tell that they don't have a real crack sound to them, or like a body and, a beater sound. They really have kind of one more distinct sound to them. Toms quite often are used more for fills or for those spots where they really want it to sound different and fuller. They're rarely used for the whole song, they're usually used for a part of a song. And so it's good to know what they sound like and when they're used, and that'll help you do your mixes better as a whole. The next thing we have are what are called overheads. So again, with electronic drums, you don't actually have any mics that are over the drummer's head, but that's where the term comes from. With acoustic drum kits, there was mics that were placed over the drummer's heads to pick up mostly the cymbals, but quite often they end up picking up the entire drum kit to a degree. So on most electronic drum kits, the cymbals will be the loudest things in there, and they'll be the crash cymbals, usually the most. And crash cymbals, again, have a large wash sound to them. They don't really have a ting as much as a swelled wash sound. And then usually these electronic drum kits will also simulate the sound of picking up the whole drum kit a little bit, adding a bit of ambience to the drum kit. And usually that sounds fairly good. It sounds a bit more natural. And and so then again, crash cymbals as part of the overheads are quite often used for accents. Quite often they're used at the beginning of a song or beginning of of a beat or beginning of a part. They're not usually used throughout an entire part. If they are, that's again, supposed to be a part. It's supposed to be really lively and really loud. And they don't contain almost any low frequency information. They almost are just high pitched. And so it's good to know what your crashes sound like and when they get used. And I'm just going to find a spot and we're going to listen to them. So right there it's picking up just kind of the acoustics of the drum kit that is simulating. Picking up some of the hi-hats. And there we go, there's a ride sound, a side crash, another crash. And then there's going to be a different crash coming up right away. So it's good to know that quite often they have two different sounding crashes, so they can have two different kind of accents and all the other sounds that get picked up in an overhead mic. So that is how all the different drums sound. It's good to know that all the drums will have a different way that they play a different part in the beat. And also too, if you're in a campus where you only have one channel for kick and one channel for kit, even though you can't now manipulate all these individual channels individually, it's still good to know what each part is supposed to sound like and what they're supposed to do. And that'll help you make different choices on how you might EQ or compress that channel. And you can still sometimes set those levels on the drum brain itself. And if you need to make changes, that knowing what they do will help you do that. So then we're going to move on to the bass guitar. And a couple things about the bass guitar. It adds a lot of body to your mix. It adds a lot of weight to your mix. It also grounds the song and makes it sound fuller and bigger. Sometimes if they want a song to start off softer and get feeling larger, they'll have the bass not play off the top, and then all of a sudden it'll come in and all of a sudden be like, wow, there's the song. So it's good to know that the bass needs to be something that's going to add a lot of size and presence. It's going to be something that's going to be helpful. And bass guitars have a bit more distinct sound, that there's a variety of different bass guitars, a variety of different strings, a variety of different settings. But for the most part, they're going to sound roughly similar in that they're going to have a fair bit of low end energy, and they're going to have some clarity on the top of the strings. If they have too much clarity, sometimes they'll get a string noise, and you might need to reduce that. And yeah. Another purpose for the bass guitar, a lot of people don't realize, is that they quite often are a pitch reference for singers. Singers quite often need to get their pitch, and you're quite often going to look to either the piano. Sometimes they get acoustic guitar or electric guitar, but most often it's either piano or a bass guitar, because bass guitar quite often plays the fundamental root notes of any chord. So if a singer is trying to find their pitch, quite often they're going to be listening to the bass. So it's good to know that, because when you're setting monitors for vocalists, sometimes adding in a little bit of bass will help them with their pitch. So bass guitar, again, sounds can have a variety of sounds, and we're going to listen to the one that was recorded for this session. So, as I mentioned, there's a low-end energy in there as well as clarity of string noise. And the two together will help you be able to hear the defined notes of the bass guitar. One other important aspect to the bass to think about is how the bass works in relationship to the kick drum. They're the main two instruments that are going to occupy your very low frequency range, and quite often they're the main two things that are going to be in your subs. So the way those two play off each other is very important. If you don't set them up well, they'll actually clash with each other and get in each other's way, so you can't hear one or the other as clearly. We're going to talk more about how to deal with that better in the next session, but let's listen to how those two sound together, so the kick drum and the bass guitar. So those right now are doing pretty well. You can hear both pretty distinctly and clearly. Even if you listen to how the bass plays, it's usually in relation to the kick. He's actually quite often choosing how he's playing to some degree in what the kick is doing. So it's good to know what the bass is doing and how it relates to the kick. The next thing we want to talk about is a synth or synthesizer. This could also be really called a musical workstation. Quite often they're not actually synthesizing sound, but they're actually playing back samples. But basically they're going to be a keyboard that's going to play more piano, or sounds aren't going to necessarily be a piano sound, but they might be like an organ sound or a string sound, some kind of synthetic sound Could even be like an 80s pop sound. So synthesizers have a range of sounds they can use. And their purpose is going to be different depending on what type of song it is or what type of band it's with. With Church of the Rock, there's usually 2 or 3 main things that a synth will do. Either they'll just do pads, which means they're just kind of holding chords, and they just have a long sustained note. And that's not going to be ever like a really distinct part in your mix, but it'll fill in your mix so that everything will sound fuller and bigger. If you would take that element out, your mix would all of a sudden start sounding weaker and lesser, but you might not be able to really distinctly tell what that synth player is playing since it's just one big long chord. The second kind of thing that the synth quite often is responsible for is like a church organ sound. So that sound is usually more energetic. If you're just doing any kind of gospel song, it's a really important element in it. And that sound really cuts through the mix really well and quite often does want to be heard, and you do want to probably put that up in your mix so that it really adds to the rhythmic and energy level of a song. And that's another part what they do. And then the third thing is more like that synthesizer sound. So if you ever do a sound that's supposed to sound like electronic music or like that synth pop kind of sound, some of the new Hillsong Young and Free songs, they're going to quite often do these very artificial sounding sounds that are meant to sound like electronic music. So it's good to know what the synthesizer is doing in each song and what it's trying to accomplish in your mix. Sometimes you won't know that offhand, so you need to listen to the songs ahead of time and even talk to your worship leader. Okay, what is the synth doing? Or even for each song, be listening to the discussion, and they might be talking to each other about what the synth is doing. So that's another good reason why you want to take notes, another good reason why you want to prepare in advance for your worship sets while you're rehearsing with the band. As far as the different sounds go, again, there's a wide variety of synthesizer sounds. I'm just going to play for you what we have on this session. So, as I said, in this case, they're doing more of that pad sound, where it's just holding kind of the main chords of the song as the chords change. And again, that wouldn't ever be this really distinct, obvious part in the mix, but without it, the whole mix would be weaker. Next thing I want to talk about is your piano. Now again, on most of the Church of the Rock stages, it's not an actual acoustic piano. It's an electric piano. It's different than a synthesizer, and then usually it's much more of those classic like an actual piano sound, or other things that you would associate with that shape and size. So you might have an organ sound, but you would never have, for example, like an 80s synth sound. You very rarely would ever have a string sound. And the most part, it's just going to play actual piano sounds. And piano is different than synth. That usually it's a bit more, it has a bit more attack to it. It has usually a broader spectrum of what it can do in the mix. It might be the main instrument in the song. It might just be adding a couple notes here and there. So it's really good to know individually for which song what the piano is doing, and if it's going to be something that's going to be really prominent in your mix or not. This is another place where you want to be listening to the songs ahead of time. You want to be talking to your worship leader, figuring out exactly what the role of the piano is for each particular song. Different piano players will know how to play a bit differently with the band. If a piano is ever playing on its own, it might play differently than with a band because it has, again, this large range of notes. And if it goes really low or really high, it can be really distinct and beautiful. But in a mix with a full band, if they're in the lower section, you actually probably won't hear them very well because now they're going to be colliding with your bass, your electric guitars, your acoustics. So a piano player who really knows how to play well with a worship band will, for the most part, keep their playing a little bit in the higher range, and they'll play slightly differently at different timings so that you can really still hear them clearly without getting in the way of other things. So let's listen to the piano on this recording. So I think this person is one of these people who does know how to play well with a band because most of the notes are up in that higher range. They're really prominent. They have nice quick attack, which means they're kind of hitting them fairly hard. And that piano will be able to cut through a mix with a full band and still be heard and still sound really good. Yeah, a piano is, again, going to be something you have to consider how it relates to the synthesizer. They quite often will play off each other, playing different parts. They could potentially both do a church organ sound, so quite often they talk to each other on which one is going to play that part. But for the most part, if someone is on piano for a weekend, they use a piano sound the whole time for every single song, and they'll play differently if they're supposed to be the main instrument or if they're supposed to be just a part of the mix. So again, good to know all those different things. Next thing we have is acoustic guitar. Acoustic guitars can have lots of different shapes and sizes. Every different acoustic guitar player will play with a slightly different style. They'll use different strings, they'll have different pickups. So you might have a fairly wide range of sounds with an acoustic guitar. So you want to be able to treat each one individually. Don't ever have a thing where, okay, acoustic guitars I do this with. You want to make sure you look at each one, address it individually, and listen for all the different aspects. You know, some are bigger and they have more low end, some are thinner and have less body to them. And so, and they also, again, are in that same category where they can either be just doing chords and being kind of fitting in to fill in the mix, or they could be a really distinct part. So again, you want to know what they're doing, how they're playing, and what prominent role they're supposed to play in the mix. Let's listen to the acoustic guitar on this track. So that one has a bit more of a sharpness to it, a bit more of a higher end to it, a bit of body as well. Some will have a bit more body, but sometimes that, again, that could get in the way of the electric guitars or even the bass if there's too much of that. So how you treat that acoustic might depend on everything else happening in your mix. But yeah, it's good to know what they sound like. Sometimes adding a little bit of reverb to your acoustic can sound nice. That's a good option for some of those. You almost never would add reverb to an electric guitar, because quite often they'll do that themselves. But for an acoustic guitar, that might sound nice. Which then now leads us to electric guitars. Now, electric guitars, even much more so than acoustic guitars, will widely vary in their tone. There's many different guitar styles, there's many different models, again, lots of different string options. Every single electric player will have a different amp, a different pedal. Now there's many virtual amp simulating pedals. So each one can have a wide range. They can go from sounding really big and full, really sharp, really distinct mid-range. Some will have more high-end. There's really quite a different range. And then how they play makes a big difference as well. So electric guitar, you're going to have to be really thoughtful in how you're adding them to the mix. Most of the sound is going to come from the guitarists themselves, so they're going to work that out with the worship leader. But you need to take what's been given to you and do your best with it to make it sound its best and make it fit in with the mix as best as you can. Again, like the other rhythm instruments, there's parts of the songs they're going to be the really big, main, prominent part, and then other parts to songs where they're going to be sitting back and just kind of filling in. So again, you want to know those parts. You want to know what role they're playing for each different part of the song. Most of the time in a song, you're turning your electric guitar up and down quite a bit. You're riding the fader fairly often, and you're making choices based on what's happening in the song. So let's listen to the electric guitar that was on this track. In this case, it was on 2 separate faders, so that's why you'll see me pushing up 2 faders. Sometimes hearing these parts without the whole song is kind of hard to tell what they were playing and why exactly. That part, they're holding one chord down. There wasn't a ton of clarity to it, but that's what probably was called for in that part of the song. Later on, he might have a really clear sounding song part and even more distortion or less distortion. So even as you're sound checking the guitarist, you want to have him go through some of his different sounds so that you can be aware of how they're going to sound and how to make sure that they're roughly the same volume and on what they're going to be like in your mix. So as I mentioned already a few times, these main 4 kind of rhythm instruments, the synth, the piano, the acoustic, and the electric guitar, you want to see how they all interact with each other. And in the band, they're already talking to each other and figuring how they're going to play off each other. But if you really think of how they all work together yourself, you'll be able to achieve a better mix. And so, for example, you can't have everything be the loudest thing. So something has to be more prominent, something has to be less. You never want to have it so that you never hear the instrument at all. Kind of like, why did they show up then? But there's times where it's not going to be the the biggest thing in the mix, and they know that, and they're playing for that style. But then there's times where they're supposed to be the biggest thing in the mix. So the best you can do to keep track of that, the best you can do to make emphasize those things and go along with the mix, the better you'll do. So the next big important section, probably the most important section of any worship song, since we're worshiping the Lord, is the vocals, because they're singing the actual words of worship to God. And vocals can be a tricky thing. Each individual voice is unique. As you know, you recognize a person's voice without even seeing their face, because every person's voice has a different timbre to it. And then how microphones pick up their voices varies as well. And then besides that, in Church of the Rock, in any kind of worship setting, we almost always have a number of vocals, up to 5 or even 6. And so they all play a different role as well. They'll be singing different parts. I don't always actually remember all the names of the parts, but there is tenors, altos, sopranos, and fills. You don't necessarily need to know exactly that a tenor does this range and the alto does this range. Basically, as long as you can listen to them all and figure out, okay, this one goes kind of higher, this one kind of goes lower, this one kind of stays in the middle. Fills refers to when they go off the main melody and they sing at a different time. And so as long as you know kind of what generally people are doing and how they're mixing together, that's going to be the important part. And how you might treat the vocals might depend on what part they're playing. But for the most part with a vocal, you want it to sound like that person's voice. You want it to sound natural and full. You don't want to have it sound overly affected. But again, you want to treat it in such a way where you can hear the lead vocal the most with the background vocal group behind it. And again, I said background vocal group because we want to have not just 4 individual extra voices, but essentially you'll have a lead vocal and then a background vocal group. So the way you blend them together can make them sound more cohesive, almost like a not really a small choir, but a small group. So yeah, as far as levels go, I already kind of mentioned, but the lead vocal should always be able to be heard. People need to have someone they can follow along with, someone they can sing with. The lead vocal almost always does the main melody. And so that should be obviously the thing they hear the most. But again, in Church of the Rock settings, we don't want that significantly above the instruments. We just want it just a little above the instruments. And with the background vocal groups, right around that same level as the other instruments. Another thing to think about, which will help you in your mix, is the dynamic range of a singer. Some singers, or all singers, will go from being louder, being quieter, to being louder. And so you don't want to completely destroy that dynamic range with compression, which we'll cover in a couple sessions from now. But if someone goes from being too quiet to too loud, you'll either lose them in the mix and have them come back different parts in the songs, or you'll have them in the correct place in the mix and they'll come out really loud and just screaming and way over the top. So you want to be aware of how people are. Some people have more dynamic range than others. They go from almost whispering to screaming, and so you want to know who you have and how you deal with them. And part of this is getting to know your singers, getting to know their styles, getting to know what they do, and accommodating with how you EQ and how you compress those people. So another thing to talk about is choir. Choir is unique in the sense that you're not really trying to get all those individual singers as individuals. You really want to capture choir as a group. Quite often a choir will be made up of all those different types of singers, those sopranos, tenors, altos, and leads. Maybe not leads, but all those different types of singers. And you don't want to capture any one of them individually. You really want to capture the way their voices blend together. There's actually something happens acoustically of all these voices blending and coming together. That's what you're trying to capture. So whenever you're miking a choir, you don't want ever to get just one person's voice. You want to capture the group. And the way you blend those into your mix quite often is very similar to your background vocal group. That they're sitting behind the lead singer, around the level of the overall instruments. And quite often your background vocals will blend in with your choir a bit to almost sound like one sort of really large choir. That's a bit something you'll see from song to song. It might change as well, but it's something you want to consider as how you're mixing and what you're doing with your choir. So the last thing I want to talk about today is going to be a really critical skill you can develop and that you can do anytime, even as you're driving in your car, as you're working your day with headphones in, is something I like to call critical listening. Basically what you're doing with critical listening is you're listening to a song, not just to enjoy the song, but to listen to figure out why it's a good mix or why it's a bad mix. So for example, one way you could do a critical listening is to find a worship song you really like, perhaps one that was even recorded live, and listen to it and think to yourself, now why do I like the way this sounds? This is a really good way to develop your ear because you start to develop a sense for different tones of things. You start to figure out balances and mixes, even EQ settings you start to get a sense of. People who really do this for a number of years can even start to tell you stuff like, oh, that song was recorded, that guitarist must have had a Fender guitar through a Marshall stack using this mic, because they really get to know the songs and sound so well. Obviously don't expect that kind of level out of any average person, but what you could do is just listen to songs and start to figure out why you like them and what makes them good. Some of the stuff you want to specifically be listening for is the tone and the sound of every different instrument and vocal. If you really like a guitar sound, you can try to think, well, why do I like that? Okay, well, it's nice and clear, but it's not sharp. It has some body, but it's not overwhelming the mix. You might think of the tone of a vocal and say, like, the way it was recorded. It's not SC. You don't hear all this stuff. You hear that. It doesn't sound like it's been squashed to death. It sort of sounds natural. It sounds full, and those kind of things. You might want to listen to, when you're critical listening, the level of the lead vocal compared to the level of the background vocals. You might want to listen for specific parts coming through at certain times and going back down, getting a sense that where the mix might have been changed, where they might have gone from a louder spot to a quieter spot, and how they go in between those parts. You might want to figure out what's the main instrument in that whole song or in different parts of the song, which ones are not really playing a main role. The transitions from verses to choruses, how that's happening. You might think about how they're using reverbs or other effects, or even just how they're blending certain elements together or making sure that they sound distinct. One other thing, if you're listening to a stereo mix, you might be like how they position things left or right in the headphones and why they might do that. Is it to sound natural? Is it to match how it looks on a stage, or is it just for an effect? Even how many of each instrument is there and what parts they're playing. And so as you start doing this, you listen to a song, not just to enjoy it, but for all these different things. You'll start to develop a sense of what is good, what is not good. And this will help you then when you mix, just to try to aim for, maybe not the exact same things, but at least it'll give you a sense of what you could be aiming for, what something could sound like. And this is a way to develop a way of what should be good and what should not be good. So we're going to do even a bit of that practice right now. So we're going to listen to a song. It's called Prince of Peace. It's recorded by Hillsong United. Interesting thing about this recording, I think some background on it might give you a sense of how they did this recording. They actually went out to Israel, and they went outdoors and recorded most of this outdoors and added tracks in later. And they mixed the whole thing after the fact. So this song is a good example for critical listening because there's some really interesting ways they did some mixing, a bit different than an average mix. And so we're going to listen to it a little bit, and then I'm going to comment on a few things I enjoy with the mix or just notice about the mix. So let's hear this song.
My heart is storm clouds raging deep within. The Prince of Peace came bursting through the wind.
So first off, start doing critical listening. What are you actually hearing? So first thing is there's obviously an acoustic guitar. You almost see that they're kind of, the fact that they were outdoors, you almost can subtly hear in the background, is that picking up some bugs, or is that some kind of wind noise, or some kind of background noise? That could be any of those things. And then when her vocal comes in, it's really full and actually significantly louder than the acoustic. So as you're critical listening, you go, wow, that might not be how you hear normal mixes, but in this mix, it just really works. It's meant to sound sparse, it's meant to sound really close to you, and it really gives that sense of intimacy because you're really hearing this vocal really just prominently and really full. So let's keep listening for a bit.
The violet sky held its breath, and in your light I found rest, tearing through the night, riding on the storm.
A couple other things to notice there is that you can hear this nice reverb at the end of her notes, but it doesn't go on forever, but it's really nice and tasteful. So that might be a thing to think about, how you use reverb, how it's not being used. And also when that background vocal comes in, it's not at the same level. It's noticeably lower than the lead vocal, yet it's complementary and it's really well blended. So let's listen some more.
Staring down the fire, my eyes found yours, shining like the sun, striding through my feet.
Yeah, so that keeps going. And let's go to a spot where they actually add a bunch of instruments in, and let's see what they've done with the mix. So all of a sudden, we jumped ahead a fair ways, but now they've added in some drums, but all you're really hearing is kind of quietly either like a hi-hat or a ride cymbal. There's a low-end noise, which it's a bit hard to define. Is that a bass guitar? Is that a synthesizer? All it is kind of like whoo. And in this case, there's no clarity to it at all. So again, in our bass we showed earlier, there was body and clarity. In this case, there's only body. In this case, that's something that's different than most mixes, but that worked out really well in this mix. You might have also heard that there was some electric guitar coming in lightly. So let's listen to that one more time. And if you're listening closely, you actually probably also hear a glockenspiel. So Song United is known for using a glockenspiel, but it's just the occasional note just to add a little highlight. So one thing, if you keep listening to this song, is you notice her vocal always stays really high on top, but then she'll go from singing quietly to almost singing really loud. And they're riding her level so that she always stays that kind of similar level up top. She never starts to sound way too loud to you. Even when she's screaming, it's still at that same loud level. So that was either use of compression or putting her level up and down, which is probably a bit of both. So I really recommend using critical listening as an exercise you can do all the time to develop your ear, especially when you're at Church of the Rock and you're on Planning Center online and they send you the list. If you haven't listened to those songs, I'd say it's a great practice to listen to those songs, do a critical listening of them, and you'll already be prepared for what parts could be in that song, how the song flows, and its different tones and those kinds of things. So mixing is a really important part, obviously, of being an audio tech. It's the main thing you do. It's kind of when you put together all of the different parts you've learned. And we're now just one step away from actually getting into really doing the mix. But the more prepared you can be to mix, the more you can do to prepare yourself to be organized, to have everything in its right place, that it's simpler for you to find. The more that you have notes to help yourself, the easier you will be able to make a great mix and be able to do it consistently from week to week. If you want to become excellent at audio mixing, knowing what style you're trying to mix, what you're trying to achieve in your mix, a logical soundboard, layout, rehearsing your mix, taking good notes, knowing each instrument's sound and purpose, and critical listening is going to go a long way to help you achieve that goal. I would also add that if you are mixing for an event that's more complex, do those things like a stage plot, an input list. Those things will help you really figure out exactly what you need to do and when, and what kind of stuff you need to achieve that. So now it's time to answer the questions below, and then in session 6, we'll finally get into mixing. God bless.